Astrid, a late medieval European poleaxe reproduction, forged by Whitewell Arms. More specifically, she's an interpretation of the historical find codenamed A926, currently on display in the Waltz collection in London. If that sounds familiar, it might be because it's the same specimen that the knightly Poleaxe from Arms and Armour is based upon, which probably qualifies as the most well-known poleaxe reproduction today. The museum ties the A926 to the end of the 15th century, which seems to be in line with most other poleaxe finds. All the examples I've been able to come across stem from the 15th or 16th century. One somewhat counterintuitive fact you may stumble upon while researching this subject is that the axe component of the poleaxe isn't completely mandatory, despite what the name suggests. See, many polearms completely devoid of axe heads, instead featuring different combinations of hammers and beaks, were also widely referred to as poleaxes at the time. But Astrid, she's a proper poleaxe, with a frontal axe head, backhand hammer, and middle spike trinity. Compared to the piece she is based upon, she is quite a bit shorter, measuring in at about 175 cm in length, and I specifically asked for this because I wanted it to be closer to my own height. I first came across this kind of weapon in chivalry medieval warfare, which solidified in my mind at an early age the idea that the poleaxe was a relatively short weapon. But while there may have been short variations of this weapon throughout history as well, it's definitely not the whole story. The A926 is nearly 2 meters long, and having briefly looked over accounts of contemporary fighting treatises for the poleaxe, a lot of emphasis appears to have been put on utilizing the tail end of the weapon in conjunction with a cross. This does not only necessitate a different kind of grip from what you'd practice on an axe primarily made for cutting, but also goes to explain why a longer pole is desirable. I managed to update my childhood image of the poleaxe before I decided to buy one, and I have to say I'm pretty happy with the length I ultimately settled for. Turning our attention to the axe head, we can see that the edge is almost perfectly straight, and this sets it apart from many other poleaxes, as they often featured curved profiles. The neck, however, does curve, first very steeply and then progressively slower toward the terrace, after which it curves more steeply again, down toward the edge. At the terrace it is quite blunt, there's still quite a lot of thickness to it in that spot, but as we move further down it tapers quickly thanks to the edge bevel, and comes to a sharp point. While there are many sharp points in various places around this weapon, this is probably the last spot that I would want to press my finger against. It's extremely acute. The contour is sprinkled with tiny stamped out dots, not achieved with machine precision, but rather a human touch. As for dimensions, the blade edge sits about 9 cm out from the shaft, and it stretches 21.5 cm in length. I also believe to have identified a secondary bevel on this side of the edge. That would supposedly add to its sharpness, which, for the record, is pretty good. Not as razor thin as some of the swords I own, but this is an axe after all. It makes up for in leverage and weight what it lacks in sharpness. In the middle of the blade, 3 holes have been punched in a triangular and overlapping pattern. How exactly this was achieved, I do not know, but the practical implication of it is a slightly lower weight for the weapon, and aesthetically it looks absolutely gorgeous. There's a lot of fine detail to admire on this poleaxe, but this part, with its 3-dimensional complexity, is one of my absolute favorites. Just southeast of there we find the maker's mark of Whitewell Arms. Upon flipping the blade over, we can see that its absence is the only visible thing distinguishing one side from the other. The hammerhead features a pyramid checkerboard surface, but compared to more extreme hammer examples with downright prongs, it can still be considered fairly flat. The purpose of this pattern, aside from the stunning looks, would have been to increase friction and prevent the weapon from sliding or glancing off rounded target surfaces. In terms of size, the impact surface area is comfortably in the higher end, with its impressive 2.4 by 7.1 cm squared. At the shaft, the hammer neck is of the exact same thickness as the axe, but in contrast it tapers aggressively at the start, and only starts expanding past its original size at what's roughly the halfway point to its maximum distance from the shaft, which I have tallied to about 6.6 cm. It's aesthetically consistent with the axe, as we see the same pattern of dots and diagonal lines repeat themselves around the head. The final component of the cross is the spike or dag. It stretches nearly 20 cm tall and is divided into 3 subsections: the base, the middle and the peak, all separated from each other by these pretty looking balconies. While the hammer is my favorite from a utility standpoint, I think the dag on this poleaxe holds the highest artistic value of the 3 components of the cross. It's robust and menacing, but also incredibly ornate. When rotated, it feels as though the entire base suddenly comes to life, like it moves and wobbles, because there isn't a single straight line in there. And it works really well in this case, because the weapon is in no way trying to be perfectly symmetrical. Instead, these quote-unquote imperfections just end up giving it an awful lot of character, and result in a fabulous expression. Which incidentally coincides well with the historical poleaxe, often rich in decoration, and a symbol of status for the owner. The spike starts out at the base with 4 sides, then doubles to an octagonal prism in the middle section, only to return to a rectangular form at the peak, which narrows quite evenly into an eventual sharp point. This one is again not quite as sharp as the ends of the axe blade, but still plenty sharp to cause some real damage, as we will hopefully demonstrate later. The intersection with the 3 components of the cross and the shaft all joined together is accentuated by these pointy knobs, one on either profile. I've seen some illustrations online where knobs almost exactly like these function as bolts and nuts, and thereby help secure the cross and langets to the shaft. I can't say for sure if that's the case here, but it seems like a safe bet. I didn't actually get around to testing them as offensive instruments, but they would definitely add a bit of punch if you were to hit something with the flat side of the poleaxe. You know, in case having 4 weapons on a single stick wasn't already enough. Moving on to the shaft, we first have the aforementioned langets that run from the cross down the pole on all 4 sides. They stretch about 56.5 cm in length on the 2 profiles, and a humble 49 on the remaining 2 sides. The purpose of these would have mainly been to protect the shaft from breaking in action, partly by serving as a protective layer when blocking incoming strikes directly with the shaft, but perhaps more so as general structural reinforcement when landing powerful hammer or axe strikes itself. There are 4 rivets to each langet, not counting the one fastening the spike to the shaft, and at the bottom ends, the langets spring into these flowery decorations. The shaft changes in thickness from top to bottom. It's generally thicker in the middle and narrows toward the ends. On the profile, the ends are about 3 cm thick, and it peaks at 3.6 somewhere between the first and second rivet. However, including the langets in this measurement kicks that number up closer to 4.3 instead. On the face side, it is slimmer. Starting out at 2.6 at the bottom, it climbs to 3.2 at the height where we measured our previous peak. And at the top end, it is so thin as to completely disappear behind the langet, implying a thickness of less than 2 cm. The shaft is mainly in the shape of a rectangular prism, but also features a slight bevel at each of the 4 corners. Measured from the end of the langets to the start of the butt spike, the shaft is 144 cm long. And while we're down here, we may as well deal with the final offensive components of the poleaxe, the butt spike. It's about 7.5 cm in length, and its shape draws my mind to the chess rook, or indeed, king. The crown bears some resemblance to the pattern we saw on the hammer, but these structures are much larger in size, and significantly sharper at that. It's clearly been riveted in place, so presumably a lathe portion of the shaft is hidden underneath. While each component of this Whitewell Arms reproduction differs from the original to some degree, the one thing that is completely absent is the rondel. Having briefly investigated this topic, there doesn't seem to be a conclusive answer to whether or not they should be used, but that is not to say that the decision was irrelevant, because a rondel greatly affects how the weapon can be handled, and brings about different strengths and weaknesses. My poleaxe is without a rondel because I did not make a point of it when placing the order, and this is how he chose to make it when the decision was free. If you want to learn more on that topic, or the poleaxe fighting technique in general, which I personally don't know very much about, Matt Easton of Gladiatoria fame has a great resource on it, so I'll insert a card for that here. And before we conclude the anatomy section, there must be a mention of the weapon's weight, which my scale placed at 3,415 grams. In order to test the concussive instruments on this weapon, I put together a practice pal in preparation for this shoot, and slapped on a reenactment cuirass. Of course, this was my first time actually using the weapon, so I started off with a few cautious swings, and upped the aggression over time. We didn't have to wait long for signs of impact though, as even the first strike left a very clear mark on the breastplate. I have to say I was very happy with how the practice pal turned out. Hitting it was a lot of fun, and it felt like a great way to test the weapon, even if it meant ruining a piece of armor. As opposed to slicing bottles, hitting this target was comparatively easy, but there is definitely room for improvement in form, and perhaps the most noteworthy mistake from this segment was that I managed to bend the spike quite badly with a few misguided swings. It was a little hard to know at the time precisely what had caused it, but after looking at the footage, I now believe the main culprit to be the strikes where I accidentally hit the arms of the practice pal with a dagger. and there were quite a few of them. 4, in fact. As if that wasn't enough, I also managed to scratch the tree to the left of the armor with a spike at one point. Look at that. Considering how much leverage this swing's bring about, I'm not too surprised it got deformed. I was successful in restoring it to its original shape once I was back home though, using another hammer, ironically. Next came a reprise of the bottle cutting ritual. This turned out to be really difficult with the axe. I think most of my attempts were unsuccessful. Things improved a little toward the end, but overall it wasn't a great experience. One additional issue was that the pedestal caved in almost immediately. I managed to completely destroy the platform with one of my first swings. And after that it was really hard to get the bottles to even stand up. I tried out some stabs on them as well. That went okay, all things considered, but neither of these attack types were as satisfying on the Poleaxe as they were with my swords, and I feel like some sort of leather torso would have made a better test subject in this case. Fortunately, there were some dead trees in the area as well, so water bottles weren't the only thing on the axe's menu that day. Cutting branches felt a lot better, and more in line with how the weapon should be used. The final thing to test was of course the butt spike, which brought us back to the cuirass. And these punches also felt really satisfying. Like you could really tell how the crown of the butt spike bit into the armor, locked the weapon in place, and allowed for all that force to be properly concentrated into a single area, despite the armor's roundness. After we were done, the armor looked like this. The big indentations are from the hammer strikes, and the scratches are a result of the pyramid pattern on its head sliding along the armor. The groups of smaller indentations scattered around the surface are then signs of impact from the butt spike instead. Now if we take a look at the weapon as well, there are a few signs of wear on the hammerhead, particularly on the corners, and we see a fairly similar effect on the butt spike as well. I'm not really knowledgeable enough to determine if this kind of wear is reasonable, but let's just say that if you want to keep your weapon in mint condition, don't destroy a piece of armor with it, because that will leave marks behind. In terms of imperfections on the weapon out of the box, there are a number of things to mention. For instance, there are marks and scratches such as these all around the place. The axe and hammer are not completely in line with the shaft either, as you can tell from this image. The butt spike has quite a few scratches on one of the 4 sides, and one of them in particular is deep enough that you can even feel it with your nail. However, the worst offender is probably this langet on the left side profile. It deviates quite substantially from the middle of the shaft as it travels further down, and nearly flies off the edge at the end. That doesn't look too great. But because the weapon is so busy in general, and because it's been purposely handcrafted, none of the things I've mentioned here stand out all that much. And I still come away thinking that the imperfections on this Poleaxe bother me less than the imperfections on the 2 swords I've showcased before. One more semi-negative thing I've found is that the wood dye comes off quite easily. And it is in fact the sole reason why I originally bought the gloves that I've been wearing in this video. See, when the axe was new, I had to wash my hands every time after handling it, as the dye had come off and smudged them down. At this point, about a year down the line, that doesn't really happen anymore, but that's because it's now lost enough color that it could even do with a re-dye in some places. Now if you want to get a weapon with the same color, this is what Whitewell Arms refer to as dull black. As for a price, well, this Poleaxe set me back £900, shipping excluded. A lot of money for a decorative object, no doubt, but it is probably to be expected, given how much time goes into making one. So I don't think the price is outlandish. I also haven't tested any other polearms yet, so there isn't much to be gained from me trying to compare it to other alternatives. All I can say for now is that I haven't regretted making the purchase, and would, until further notice, happily point other Poleaxe enthusiasts in the same direction. Thank you for watching this showcase of Astrid, a late medieval European Poleaxe reproduction, forged by Whitewell Arms. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out Gormlaith, my very first medieval weapon. Or just wait for the next one, whenever that will be. Alright, Burke is out.